I am Austin Williams, Director of the Future Cities Project. So I'd like to welcome you all to this international bookshop. Barnie, my co-host, you can see on screen there is Alistair Donald. Just in case anything goes awry with the technology, he will step in and host this event. So good evening, China. Good afternoon, Europe. Good morning, America. And good grief is at the time in Australia. So tonight we're going to be discussing this book, which is RUAN's book, as I say, just hot off the presses, Confucius's Courtyard, subtitled Architecture, Philosophy, and the Good Life in China. Xing is the founding dean and chair of architecture at the School of Design at Shanghai Jiao Tong University in Shanghai. Prior to that, he was director of architecture at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, in Australia. And he's written very widely on the subject of culture and architecture, and he's a very well-respected intellectual critic and writer. The purpose of this, Barney, is for the author to actually to convince you to read it. It's a thoroughly recommended book as far as I'm concerned. It's scholarly. I won't lie, it's quite difficult, but I think it's very rewarding. So I recommend it to everyone here. It kind of compares, it kind of looks into China from ancient to modern. It kind of compares West and East and how those similarities and differences are evident today, as in the Chinese versus the Roman courtyards, for example. I was looking at the fact that President Xi is the only president in China to use Roman numerals in his name. That's something you can think about. Or he might be the 11th president, I don't know. Anyway, lots to talk about. The way that Barney works is this, that I've given Xing, Professor RUAN, 5 minutes, possibly slightly more, to discuss the general ideas behind the book. Then I will ask maybe 4 or 5 or 6 questions just to bring out some more of those ideas and to give Xing more opportunity to discuss those ideas. And then it's over to you. So if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you have opinions, please feel free to raise them. One general point to raise is that it's a free event, obviously, so you're all very welcome. If you would like to make a donation, please do so. If you'd like to make a very large donation, we'll be even more grateful to you. Anyway, the magic of technology is such that we can bring Professor Xing RUAN live from Shanghai to discuss his ideas. So Xing, that's enough from me, my introduction. Over to you, if you would. Thanks.
Thank you, Austin, and thank you very much for this generous introduction. Can you hear me clearly?
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you for this opportunity for me to share some of the ideas in the book. And also thank you, Alistair, for co-chairing this session. Austin, I must say, and I did not expect to see over 80 people in the Zoom. I thought it was going to be a very cozy conversation in your London living room in front of a burning fire. But it's a little more than spectacular than a living room conversation, and so that's wonderful. Thank you for your excellent organization skills. And also, I must say, I'm absolutely relieved that, Austin, you did not ask me to prepare a PowerPoint presentation, and you can't go anywhere in China without what we say PPT. So that's such a relief. So I will just talk. Now, 5-minute introduction to the book. I knew you were going to ask this difficult question, and you know, after having worked on this book for so long, and to summarize the book in 5 minutes is a horrible task. I do not think I can do a better job than the publisher. And when James Thomason asked me to write the cover blurb, I procrastinated, and then he just decided that he was going to do it for me, and which he did. I think he has done a marvelous job. So what I will do, if you don't mind, I will simply read out this wonderful paragraphs that James Thomason has written, and that's printed on the back cover. And of course, and there are some very generous praises that he has written in the content blurb, which I will skip, and in order to spare my own blushes. So okay, that's what James has written, and an excellent summary to my mind. For more than 3,000 years, Chinese life, from the city and the imperial palace to the temple, the market, and the family home, was configured around the courtyard. So too were the accomplishments of China's artistic, philosophical, and institutional classes. Confucius' Courtyard tells the story of how the courtyard, the most singular and persistent architecture form, holds the key to understanding, even today, much of Chinese society and the culture. Architecture form, by that, I do not mean what the buildings look like. And to put it simply, I mean the spatial organization of the building in which human life is staged. So part architecture history, part introduction to the culture and the philosophical history of China. The book explores the Chinese view of the world and reveals the extent to which this is inextricably intertwined with the ancient concept of the courtyard, a place and a way of life, which it appears has almost been entirely overlooked in China since the mid of the 20th century and in the West for centuries. Because not only the Chinese, the Mediterranean also built courtyards, and many other people in other places built courtyards. Along the way, it provides an accessible introduction to the Confucian idea of Zhongyong, the middle way, or to put in a more poetic way, the golden mean, or the doctrine of the mean. The Chinese moral universe and the virtuous good life in the absence of an awesome God, and it shows how this can only be fully understood through the humble courtyard, a space which is grounded in the earth and yet open to the heavens. And this book throughout has been illustrated by my own architecture drawings and sketches. And so according to James, Confucius Courtyard weaves together architecture, philosophy, and cultural history to explore what lies at the very heart of Chinese civilization. This is a huge claim. This is huge praise. But that's written by James, so I'm happy to use that to conclude this brief introduction. So back to you, Austin.
I'm going to say thank you very much, Xing. If only I'd realized that I only had to read the back cover, I could have saved myself 3 days with the book. Hands are already going up to ask questions. But if you can bear with us in the Barney format, we'll have a little conversation with myself and Xing at the start. I'll try and keep it to maybe 30 minutes or so, and then we can come out to you, the audience, to kind of come back with some comments and points. They don't have to be questions. It can be your own observations. But let me just start with that whole issue you ended with there, Xing, on the golden mean. Obviously, it's a concept which, you know, Socrates, even after Confucius, Socrates was writing about the golden mean. It's a very well-established philosophical idea about the middle way between two extremes. That's the kind of the core way to go. About sincerity, about honesty, about moderation, you know, and the moral foundation of a good person. Yes. And I just wondered if you could just give us a little bit more substance to that, because I think a number of people in this audience may not have read the book or may be fully acquainted with some of these concepts. So if you can just draw that out a little bit more. What is the golden mean and how does that relate to the courtyard in your view?
Well, that's a very complex question, and so one has to read the book, which I slowly discussed and explored along the way. But in what way the courtyard, which is a very simple building configuration, you know, a building that is encircled by 4 buildings, or in different shapes, but in the middle is a void that is open to sky, or the Chinese call heaven. And how is that void related to this particular wisdom of life, which Austin, you rightly put it, which was commonly shared by many wise mortals and across space and time? But the interesting thing is that, and the Chinese sticks to it for a long time. And Courtyard is a material manifestation of that persistence, if I may say, because the interesting thing about the courtyard is that if you look at the Greeks and the Romans, they built courtyards, and I say they are subtly different from that of the Chinese if you compare the courtyards which were built at the same time. But this void in the middle of the building, and that is a kind of a space not distracted by what I call the horizontal world. And I would like to call the modern world as a horizontal world if we continue to use the architectural metaphor. And we live in buildings, and buildings often multiple stories, and they are different floor plates stacked on top of each other, and we look out horizontal, and then because we live in this horizontal world, and we are distracted by what's happening in the capacious space. But living in a courtyard is an entirely different experience, because deliberately humans are not, or decided not to be distracted by the civic world, but the horizon. You answer to sky. And then the middle is accessible and is something that is quite approachable in the Chinese way. So if we say a courtyard is what I call a heavenly house, it's a vertical world. The subtle difference between the apron in a Roman courtyard is that it is linear, and you look up to it. But the Chinese do it in a slightly different way. You bring heavens to the earth. So the middle, we all share this wisdom, but in the Chinese mind, because it's something that is humanly achievable, hence it represents reason, not a compromise, not a mediocrity. And then it is moral. And so I think that's a very important, different view of things and of the world and the life. But why the courtyard is the most effective apparatus to enable people to stick to it, I think that's the long story of this book.
Yeah, that's the long story. That's why you have to read the book. But I think where you're going there is very interesting, in as much as there's an example of the mode of living, this kind of middle way, which, as we say, is kind of Taoism, is Buddhism, is Aristotle. There was a continuity of thought for a long time ago, which has been consistent in China, as you argue. But you basically say that in one example of the mode of living, true splendor comes down to blandness. You say true splendor comes down to blandness. And you give one example, you give many examples, but one example of Liu, the poet, who says he was not able to build a humble house due to the lack of funds. And obviously in my conception, and maybe the Western conception, you could only build a humble house if you had a lack of funds. But he's saying he didn't have enough money to spend on building humility. So can you address or try to explain that seeming contradiction?
Well, he must have built a courtyard, and then he built a humble one, and I would imagine. You see, the interesting thing about the Chinese mentality towards the built world, or anything that has a physical form that you can touch, the Chinese usually do not pay too much attention to it, but it is the idea that matters more. So when Li managed eventually to build his garden house, and any garden house would be a courtyard in one way or another, And then he, according to his writings, spent blissful time in that humble courtyard garden, courtyard house. And then when he was forced to sell that due to the lack of funds, and then he wrote this desperate essay, and he dared the future owner not to immediately claim the ownership of this humble courtyard. And he said the future owner, owner of the house, in exchange with a string of copper coins, now you get this house. But you must wait. You must wait long enough until you are able to put your own print onto these humble courtyards before you can claim that is your own. So it is this human relationship with the idea and the interaction that matters more. And to me, it's a desperate essay. It's even, it is even fascinating and even borderline of funny. But it does tell you a very different kind of mentality. That is, the idea of this spatial organization is far more important than the physical sizes and shapes and the location of the courtyard. So no one would have any interest in go and discovering the ideological ruins of Li Yu's house. There would be no traces whatsoever. And that's the reason why when you visit China these days, you are absolutely puzzled from the European point of view. Where's the 5,000 years of history? All cities look exactly the same. But if you look over the physical forms and shapes of the cities, if you begin to read, if you begin to understand the people's names and the names of the streets and the names of the cities and towns and villages, and then you realize it exists in a rather persistent way, but beyond the physical forms. So I guess I have been long-winded, Austin, but to return to your question, and yes, he did not have much funds. How did he build a humble house? But whatever the humble house may be, it has to be a courtyard.
Okay. That's understood. That's understood. But I'm just wondering whether some of that is a contradiction, because you point out, like you just done there, that in some ways literature or the arts and literary works were kind of more important. You say the Chinese were unconcerned with the transience of human existence and the possibility of it being immortalized in stone. They prefer to represent it in the literary world. Yes, so the buildings may crumble, but the ideas pertain. But I just wonder, because obviously one of the other examples you give is of Suzhou, which you say was unchanged for 700 years, exactly the same street patterns and the same form. And you say no other great city could have endured such longevity without any major progress. So, I mean, is there a contradiction there between the fact that those buildings, those forms, those streets maintain their longevity and the inconsequential nature of maybe those stone buildings?
On the surface, yes, that may seem to be a contradiction, and but in essence, and it is entirely persistent with this Chinese idea of something that is enduring but beyond the physical form and the life of a physical object. And let me give you two examples. And one example is that when you look at the methods of construction, which I made a brief mention in the book, and throughout the pre-modern history of China, regardless of whether the building was a royal palace or a humble house in rural areas, and basically the construction method is more or less the same. And it is the timber frame structure, and that holds the magnificent roof. So, you know, the cliche goes, when the Chinese build houses and they build the roof first, when the people in Europe build houses, you build the foundation first. And the cliche has some truth in it. but once the framework is established, and then you begin to build, you begin to enclose the buildings and the courtyards with either masonry walls or timber walls, either in solid fashion or in flimsy and humble methods. More or less exactly the same construction methods, because it is not built to last, and it is built to be adaptable, and it can be added, and it can be reduced, and with incredible flexibility. And then it is perfectly fine if you have to rebuild it, repair it, and change it, and things are interchangeable and things can be repaired. But the permanency or the monumentality of buildings in the European mind, construction method differs. And you're building a solid way and buildings lost, you invest. So you could devote a century to build a Gothic cathedral. And the idea is that that must register the transit life, and you stake your hope for immortality in stones and bricks, in stone and bricks. But the Chinese don't care, and they know there's no chance, and that is a reliable method, and therefore, you stake your hope for immortality in writing.
Okay.
Because printing press has a longer life, much longer life. And I must say, Victor Hugo woke up with this realization in the 19th century. So in the last chapter of Notre Dame in Paris, and he did a theoretical discourse of printing press versus storm.
Okay. We don't want to hear that story about how you invented the printing press, Xing. So look, one of the other aspects that you talk about in terms of the courtyard, which, as you say, is kind of a microcosm of Chinese society in some respects, or the building blocks of society. You talk about the courtyard representing an enclosure of 4 or 5 generations of one family. And all the rest of it, but also that Confucius demands participation in rites and ceremonies. So there has to be kind of a ceremonial content to these spaces as well, in order for them to, in some way, to have meaning. And Confucian rites often include kind of strict family structure, respect, everybody knowing their place. It's a very top-down idea, in as much as you also mentioned the word paterfamilias, the idea of the male as the head of the household. So I'm just wondering what it is underneath this kind of analysis in the book. Are you kind of advocating, are you recognizing and celebrating a stratified society, or are you just kind of describing it?
Not at all, not at all. I think we have to be very careful when we talk about Confucian ideas of rites and ceremonies. And too often we mistaken Confucius as a sage, and the Confucian rules and ideas of family and society as rigid and straightforward, of course. But in reality, I think this is the Confucius that has been deliberately constructed throughout the centuries for different political users and for culture purposes. It is very important, I think, also very convenient to use the courtyard as a stage to rediscover the true personality of Confucius as a human person. And he was not a sage, and he was not that famous when he was alive. Yes, he was a very well-known teacher, and allegedly he taught more than 3,000 students. And he was a failed politician, and he preached and he taught, and but he basically, in my view, and ran a business of advising, well-to-do families how to conduct ceremonies and rituals. Those students were used as apprentices. But Confucius was a real person, and he had shortcomings. And the most important thing was that he represented this middle way, and not a high demand of morality which could not be achieved. So he detested sin. He was not a saint. And so from that point of view, the Confucian world in the courtyard must be understood in a humane way. So that's why I use the examples of Confucius having a pot of tea, having a cup of tea with a blind musician, and having a casual cat sitting on the mat on the elevated hall. I also mentioned that when Confucius spoke to his son, when he's tiptoed, walking past the lower courtyard, and so the father asked the son, how's your school going, and things like that. And the way he chatted with his students and etc. But the Confucian world is a very important one, and that can be humanly achieved. No inhuman demand. If you say there is a hierarchy, there is a strict structure represented by this symmetrical sequence of courtyards, and where you place it. But at the same time, and as I have tried to illustrate throughout the book, there's always something that complements to that. So there's a back garden, there's a side door, you can sneak out. You can sneak out to a different courtyard where you can loosen up a little, and you can drink a glass of wine, and you can make jokes, and you can exercise your calligraphy, you can recite poems, and etc. So I think to see Confucius as a rigid representation of the Confucian rules is not the purpose of the book.
No, and, fine. No, Xing, I mean, I'm not here necessarily to criticize Confucianism, but what I am trying to get at is maybe some of the motivations for you writing the book and what you're trying to say in the book, because there's one or two occasions where you kind of come out of character and you say, I'm trying to do this, or I'm experimenting with ideas. It's a very nice touch that you introduced to the book, because I got the sense, especially towards the end of the book, when you have your critique of modernity and the changes that are going on in China, there was a certain sense and recognition that I found with, Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, the idea that there's a sense of loss and dramatic change, which is very clearly what's happened in China, and whether the physical template of architecture, you call it, the way that you situate yourself in the city, is gone. I mean, there's a loss in some of the way that China has developed. And I was just wondering how you get that sense of, whether you have a sense of nostalgia, and that Confucianism is a codified way of looking back to some stability of the past. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, yeah. I'm ambivalent. I'm ambivalent. Well, first, there's a sense of loss. There's no doubt about that. But the sense of loss, I think, is first and foremost related to the sense of loss in the course of the Western civilization. I would argue, because the courtyards disappeared first in your part of the world, and the fall of grace of courtyards, and the replacement of that, the replacement of this heavenly house, the vertical world, gradually with the horizontal world. And I sort of mentioned here and there Renaissance pillars in the book, and the optical ambition of Western civilization and the emergence of modern science and also the Enlightenment, and also the emergence of the individual and the completely the internalized world and the segregation, and in your part of the world in particular, in England. So the sense of loss, yes, and of course there's a sense of loss concerning the course of history in China, but I'm not nostalgic, and in fact I think what I have tried to say in the book is to give people this assurance, and despite the physical change of the city forms, and the houses that people live these days in China are no different from most of the houses that the Europeans live in these days, the apartments. Despite all of that, I think the persistency of certain ideas in one culture that is as strong as, if I may say, something like a DNA, may not be gone at all in the midst of time. And that's why I think it is, I'm saying timely again, for people to strike a good conversation and good connection, and so that certain sense of loss, which is commonly shared and can be collectively rediscovered. I'm not being too abstract when talking about this ideas, but yes, to answer your question in a brief way, there is a sense of loss, but it's not uniquely Chinese, and I'm optimistic, and the key is to strike a good conversation, and to use the Chinese courtyard as an example, as a trigger. It is my purpose.
No, I mean, that comes across very well. I think it's a very valiant effort. Obviously, the West has been suffering from a sense of loss for maybe 100 years. So, but China maybe slightly less so. Let me just quickly bang the point back to you one more time. Just trying to draw it, which is that is your book then, or is your intention a critique of modernity? Because you do say, I mean, there are many examples, but you say the dwelling had become a commodity produced by profit-driven business, and that's 100 years ago in China. When the British started building Shukeman housing, reducing the plot sizes, etc., etc. But throughout the book, there does seem to be this criticism of modernity. So you have a causing the sense of loss, but also maybe having a broader physical impact and social impact on society. And it kind of also, it reflects what's going on in the West, which is a model of anti-consumerism, which again seems to be a thread running through the book. So anyway, do you kind of recognize that characterization that I'm painting for you?
Well, I do not mind this sort of categorization, and I as you have discovered throughout the book, I like to generalize, and I do not mind if I make mistakes, but one has to generalize in order to gain some understanding. One has to take some risks, so I do not mind that sort of categorization. In a way, yes, it is a critique, but I think the question is much more complex, mainly because the problem of modernity, how do you define it? How do you define it? Lately, I was asked to write an essay on a university professor of mine who was still alive when I was in the first year in 1982. That was a long time ago. And this professor turned out to be, or it was, one of the most prominent Chinese architects in the 20th century. And when he was a young man, he was in the same class with Louis Kahn. And both of them were taught by Paul Philip Cray, the French architect. So when I wrote that essay, I talked about his modernity in his buildings, which look very eclectic from the Western point of view. You know Shanghai or Xing, and I'm sure many of the people in this conversation in this room have been to Shanghai, and you see a lot of eclectic buildings, Art Deco, etc., newer classical 19th century. But I argue in his buildings, there's this crystal clear modernity when it comes to the idea of them, for a number of reasons. One is that he's a cosmopolitan, and he borrows things from different places with ease. And the second, and he does not see the rest of a building, what a building looks like, as the essence. Instead, he focused on the organization of the buildings and its relationship with human life. And I went on and on. So I argue, if you define modernity based on the architecture, designed by Professor T.P. Yang Tingbao, and you would say modernity represents something that we commonly share. Across time and space and different cultures. So regionalism and culture specificity, sorry, I'm struggling to pronounce this word. Culture specificity and the regionalism are not necessarily his major concern. He's a modern architect, despite the look of his buildings. So I also argue he and the Louis Kahn actually share some common ground, which came from this French professor and the American version of École de Beaux-Arts. Now, I have been a little long-winded. So what I would like to say is that if you define modernity in that way, and perhaps we have never been modern, but if you define modernity from the European point of view, I think the sense of loss is a clear one. You really need to go back to at least the Renaissance. So the change from the vertical world to the horizontal world, as I put it in this horrible abstract way. So I'm happy to be categorized in that way, and I'm happy to view the book, or to let the book to be categorized and viewed as a critique of modernity. And then, but I think I welcome the rejoinder of this particular point of view, whether or not we continue to say we live in a modern world. Maybe modernity is not the precious child of modern times. Maybe the Romans and the Greeks and the Chinese 2,500 years ago already had the modernity as we understand it today. Yeah.
Well, it's a big finish. I thought it was a very good Confucian analogy there, that I throw an extreme characterization at you, a caricature, and you come back with a middle moderate response. So that was a very good summing up of the book, even in that last response. So I have many more questions to ask you, but time is marching on. And I'm very keen for members of the audience to contribute to this conversation, if you're okay, Xing. Can I first of all ask if you could all unmute and just give a round of applause to Xing, which we didn't do at the start, I apologize. Let's give Xing a round of applause for a cracking presentation. Okay, that's more than enough. Let's warm ourselves up and come back on some of these questions. So let me come to Alex, please, Alex Cameron.
Thank you very much. I'm not an architect, but I'm interested in that world. Xing, I've really enjoyed what I've heard you saying so far. To my shame, I know very little about China, but I recognise some of the things you're talking about from my place in the Mediterranean. So a few years ago, me and my family moved to Madrid in Spain. And for the last 40 years, any private or most private buildings that are being built around the courtyard that you mentioned. And it's a fantastic social space for us and for many of the people who live here. So you have, 7 buildings, 7 stories high, that surrounds the courtyard, the social space, which happens to have a big swimming pool in it, which is nice. And instinctively, it feels like a really brilliant way to build. I'm interested in the idea of solidarity. I'm interested in the idea of community and knowing the people who you are surrounded by. So it just seems like it's just good news. Now, this method of building for the Spaniards is only 40 years old or so. Now, if you look at that in isolation, I understand that I can see, well, yes, there's the tradition that goes back maybe thousands of years. But what it doesn't do, I fear, is it doesn't take into account the moment. So Xing, you talked about the importance of looking up, and you can certainly do that in the courtyard. My worry, my concern is that looking up is not the same thing as looking out. So the courtyard concept, the urbanization, as we call it in Madrid, can also act as a way of turning your back on outside life. So you end up living in a very small village and concern yourself little with what is happening outside. That's just a worry. It's a question to you. My second follow-up question is, at the end of your book, is the question or is the proposition, do you fear for Chinese architecture in the modern moment? Thank you.
Xing, I'll take 2 questions if that's okay, just so you can write them down and think about them before answering. I hope I didn't have to translate that for you, Xing. Alex is from Scotland, I'm afraid. Yeah, so but it's a very important point, and I think I know what your response is, having read the book. But I think they're very pertinent in terms of the idea of enclosure and looking inwards, looking upwards, and looking outwards. All those things, whether they can all happen at the same time. Anyway, Xing, I'll take one more question, then I'll come back to you. So, Richard.
Hi, thank you very much, Xing. I have a question about your view on conservation and preservation in China of the built environment. Do I take it that you believe that preservation by record, in other words, recording past buildings textually, is the way forward? Do you feel that conservation, preservation and protection is really of no interest to the Chinese? And will you end up with a historic built environment like Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, where everybody talks a building? Historic. I'm interested in the retention of historic buildings as part of a cultural DNA. Are you suggesting that they can be erased?
Very important point. Very important point. And I suppose that ties into the whole general conversation about authenticity, which also has a different meaning within China to the West as well. Anyway, Xing, do you want to come back on those points?
All right. Okay. Let me come back to Alex. And yeah, I can see you now, Alex, on the screen. Alex, I'm so pleased that non-architects are reading this book. I must say, I did not write this book for architects at all. And I wanted to write this book for myself, first and foremost, to gain some understanding, because this peculiar persistency of the Chinese intrigues me. That's why I started writing this book. So that's wonderful. And secondly, this is not a book to advise architects how to build future houses. And I have, as I said in the book, used Courtyard as a vehicle to gain understanding. So it is a building, and you can identify certain courtyards. Some of them are still here. You can go and visit them. But in most cases, it's a metaphor. So to return to your case in Spain, in Madrid, and if I heard you correctly, and yes, indeed, and I imagine, and you are talking about multi-story apartment buildings surrounding a court, and so there's a collective space in the middle, and the community can share, and which I think has a tradition on the continent in Europe. The English, I must say, never did that. So if you look at the history of housing on these islands, and from the late 17th century onwards, and the English invented this wonderful thing called a terrace house, and then they built in Shanghai in the late 19th century. I will come back to that. And so they actually never built the courtyards, as I have discussed in the book, nor the kind of urban courts as you see in 19th century European cities, in Paris and in Barcelona, for example. Yeah. It's wonderful. There is this space that people can share, but in essence, it is the modern apartment living. And whether or not, if you were confined within the ancient idea of the courtyard, you would fear to the certain modern frustration of being claustrophobia, being confined within. I think that's interesting that you have this concern, and that shows how difficult it is for us, the moderns, to understand an idea that existed a long time ago without knowing much of the historical and the cultural context. The reason I say this is because let's try to imagine throughout the Chinese history why the Chinese gentry in particular, we're not talking about the impoverished in the rural areas or the large populace which was illiterate. So if we focus on the gentry, and how did they sustain a kind of life confined within this heavenly house? And they did. so throughout the book, I have tried to convince people it is this confinement and the vertical relationship that provides the space of imagination. So staying put in a house is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm saying this at this extraordinary time of COVID in human history, and the way we complain about the staying put in the house. And I think that space of imagination, what I call the imagined horizon in the Chinese mind, is a fascinating thing. And hence there was this splendid creation of art, literature, and calligraphy, etc. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but another pragmatic matter, Alex, when talking about architecture, is the business of density. So if you want to build in an efficient way in a modern city, and building courts versus building objects in the middle of a block of land is far more efficient. And so I mentioned in the book at the very beginning, so Leslie Martin at Cambridge did this wonderful analysis of New York, and he took the central part of Manhattan as an example. So if you were to build the courts on the periphery of each block of the land, and if you wanted to build a density of an average 38 stories high towers by using Miss Vanderro's Seagram building as the benchmark, you could do it in court forms with an average 8-story buildings. And then as a consequence of that, you end up having more open space, parks and courts in the middle. So I guess that's food for thought for people. Now, Richard, you have asked the absolutely fascinating question. Am I advocating erasing the traces of history? And no, I'm not advocating that. And let me assure you, the Chinese have changed. The concept of conservation in Shanghai is well and strong, and stronger than ever. So if you dare touch anything that was built before the 1950s, you would commit a crime. And the people are mad about conservation. And any of the buildings built in the late 19th century and the earlier 20th century usually become internet sensation. Young people would have their photos taken in front of the buildings. Just near where I live, in Old French Quarter, there's this wonderful building designed by the Hungarian and Slovakia architect Hudes. And he was a wonderful architect, and he came to China as a war refugee without the passport, let alone an entry visa. And in less than 30 years, and he built nearly 100 buildings. And Austin, you know this architect very well. And all his buildings, including the one in my university where I have office in that, and that they are internet sensation. Young kids are mad about that. So rest assured, Richard, the Chinese are absolutely mad about the conservation. However, and this is a new thing. That's why I'm saying conversation is so important. Striking a connection is of most important consideration. But it's not exactly the same thing. In Shanghai, and I was interviewed a few times by the English channel here in Shanghai, the television, talking about the conservation in this city. And I have made this remark. I said, one thing that you see in Shanghai when it comes to conservation is that the people tend to make buildings anew. They repair them in meticulous fashion, and then in doing so, they erase the pieces of history. Yeah, cosmetic work. But that on the surface is a matter of technique. But I think if we stretch the surface, it still shows different mentalities, certainly different mentalities. And it is very rare in China to allow architects to do something that is very new in stark contrast to the old, much like the kind of conservation mentality in the Anglo world and in Australia, in America. But people do more daring things in Italy, as far as I can see. But deeply in culture mentality, and this is the novelty in China, the whole business of conversation. And also, you may understand why when certain things, when they were knocked down and demolished, people were not sentimental about them, which of course is a pity. Yeah. But culturally, the Chinese do not see the physical built world and the permanence of it as something that is terribly important. And I think I'm repeating this point. And so rest assured, the Chinese are mad about the conservation, but culturally, it's not exactly the same thing. And the dialogue is a fascinating one. It's an ongoing business. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Look, again, I'll take two at a time, if that's all right. Just bear with me.
Okay.
So we have John and Teresa.
I found your talk extremely stimulating, and that makes the book seem very appealing to read, which I haven't done, I'm afraid. And I apologize also because I missed a little bit at the beginning, so I don't know if you've clarified this. But I was wondering to what extent the courtyard configuration grew out of society at the time, and to what extent the configuration affected the configuration of society. And something else quite different. You spoke a lot about the concept of enduringness being important, perhaps not in the building, but in other ways of thinking. And I'm wondering how that has percolated out across society. Just as a sort of side note, I did actually grow up in Australia and lived in Sydney for several years, and actually worked near the University of New South Wales for several years in Kensington. I don't remember the architecture of the university being particularly, but what you reminded me of was I used to catch a bus from the glebe, and I remember looking up at a building and seeing 1905 on it and thinking how ineffably old.
Indeed.
Well, yes. Given our lifespans, it was. But very good. Thank you very much indeed. We have Neville, please. If you are still there. Oh, Neville just disappeared.
Sorry, I was unmuted.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, nice. Thank you for this introduction. It's very intriguing. I also haven't read the book yet, but I was looking at the cover, and that kind of struck me as quite intriguing. I'm not sure what that picture is. It seems to be almost like an elevated or a flip or a stacked courtyard, which makes me wonder. I have a kind of a two-tiered question that builds on Alex's point. Like, the courtyard is one of the few typologies that really doesn't allow to be stacked very well. And you could argue maybe that's the reason they kind of had to abandon it in modern day China, where you want to go up as quickly as possible. Whereas in Europe, we took that courtyard model and kind of went sideways, and now we're making, or even since 1900, we made these larger urban courtyards, if you will, right? And I was wondering if you kind of argue if that also meant with the dropping of that typology, these morals that you describe have been kind of forcefully abandoned. I'm thinking of a simple example. I lived in several courtyards in Beijing, and what was once very private, of course, after 49, they became increasingly kind of social, dense, and socially controlled, and messy, and quite, in some ways, confrontational environments. You know, you're living in very tight quarters with your neighbors, while the public arena was disregarded completely. So that world seemed to be within the courtyard kind of turned upside down on its head. And now we're trying to reverse that, and money is spent on the public realm again, and there is money to do that. But now everybody is in these towers, and you kind of wonder what that means for contemporary China and maybe the future. Sorry, it's a multi-layered question. Good, take it any way you please.
Thanks very much, Neville. Xing, yes, you're live now. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Carissa, and I'm delighted to know you spent some time in Sydney, and you even remember Kensington. Yes, I have been away for more than 3 years now, and I'll be living in Shanghai for the last 3 years. Now, your question is a wonderful one. The configuration of courtyard in relation to the kind of society, and in what way, and these two things may be related. I think this is precisely what I have been trying to make some sense of throughout the book, because what I have tried to say is that when I earlier in the book mentioned some interesting but on the surface slight differences between a Roman courtyard and that of a Chinese one, is that I mentioned that, you know, the atrium in the Roman courtyard there's no doubt about that. It's a vertical relationship. The atrium is probably equally as ceremonial as that of the Chinese courtyard. There are portraits of the ancestors, and there are seasonal rituals, and etc. But the interesting difference between the kind of courtyard that you still see in Pompeii and in Herculaneum is that the atrium is open to the street and the civic world. And indeed, Vitruvius advised the architects to design regal and glorious atrium so that anyone could walk in and spend leisurely time in the atrium while they are waiting while they're waiting for the audience from the magistrate or the lawyer. So the connection to the civic world is a very strong one. And also, as soon as you walk into the atrium, you can see into the next courtyard, in Pompeii. And that is the peristyle. There are fruit trees in it, and people have banquets there, and there are more private activities in that. You may not be welcome to enter the next one, but you get a glimpse of you. You can see that. So I say the horizontal distraction was there at the very beginning, if you use the Roman courtyard as an example. But the Chinese began in a different fashion. They would build a screen or wall. In earlier times, a freestanding wall in front of the gate. So one must pause before the wall and clear your thought, and then walk around, and then cross over the threshold into the courtyard. And in later periods, the screen was off-centered and even retreated to the courtyard itself. But in any case, and it's a different way of connecting to the civic world, as we call in Europe, and also the family, the microcosm of the society is the family-centered one. Not that it is completely defensive, you are not welcome, but it's not that easy for you to walk in. So later in the book, when I wrote about the lively activities happening in the laneway, it's called Hutong in Beijing, and the activities happen from time to time, but the street is never designed as a public space. So when there are activities, people would come out from the courtyards and would join these activities. I think metaphorically, the different configurations are related to the nature of the society. And as I argue, and the Chinese have brought down heaven to the courtyard, so that they do not have to worry about heaven too much. They can mind their own business, because there is the son of heaven, or the heaven's agent, that's the emperor, who would take care of paying the tribute and showing the respect and doing what is need to be done in time of drought or in time of crisis. Or this is the job of the paterfamilias to do that. Most of the people can mind your business, so that common sense and something that is reasonable and easy and accessible, represented by the courtyard, is the essence of the society. And then further, and I also tried to say, this shows a secular society, as we normally regard the Chinese society as a secular society, is not necessarily a materialistic society. And there is the moral foundation, and without blessing of awesome God. And I put it in that way. So yes, indeed, I think the configuration in a complex and subtle way is absolutely closely related to the nature of the society and the structure of the society. So whether or not that is completely gone without this physical template to support it, when you go to today's Beijing and Shanghai, it's largely gone. And I have no answer. And I think not. I think the idea would continue, and the power of the idea is more persistent, despite the disappearance of the physical template. So to return to Neville's question about what do you call this typology, the courtyard typology, which is impossible for you to actually stack floor plates one on top of the other, which is true. And so when buildings must go up, and what would happen? That's one question. And the other question is, you mentioned the courtyard in Beijing after after the middle of the 20th century, and the multiple families would share a courtyard, and the meaning is gone because the very microcosm of the Chinese society is a single family. You could have 2 or 3 or even 4 generations under one roof. There's no roof. That's courtyard, but it's not a collective living shared by many families. So what you have seen is what we Chinese call the miscellaneous courtyard in Beijing, and that's an entirely different story. But what would happen when cities go up? Let me try to use London as an example, if I may. And I know courtyard, to the English, the connotation is a very alien one. What does a courtyard mean? Because you never build one. And I think the Romans must have built courtyards, but you left it alone, and you started building subterranean halls. And then along the way, and this magic moment happened, you started building the wonderful terrace houses. But London, for a long time, was a horizontal city. So was Bath, so was Edinburgh. I remember this wonderful Danish architecture historian Rasmussen, and he wrote a book simply called London, a Unique City. And he was very worried about London going up. And unfortunately, London has gone up. You have the same CBD, which would rival the center of Moscow or Pudong in Shanghai. You build glass towers. You have Sir Forster's Gherkin and etc. But the essence of the horizontal London, despite the lack of this central void, and you still have your own sky and your own earth, despite the fact that it is more horizontal. So I think when cities go up and societies do change, and to what extent a certain culture idea would be powerful and compelling enough to enable people to reflect on the past, I do not know. And I think if there's any sense of loss in this book that is expressed, and in undertone or explicitly, that is the loss of our inner world. I think that is commonly shared by both Chinese and non-Chinese. And if I may use here Reichmann's terminology, dragon breed or non-dragon breed, we all share this common sense of loss. That is the loss of the inner world.
Well, I hope we got other questions which could liven the conversation back up again, since you've brought us down to a level of depression there, Xing, about our losses. So I'll take. We have 4 hands, which I'll take, if that's all right. I'll take 2 at a time. I'm sorry to keep Lawrence and Julia waiting, but I'll take these 2. Xing, if you can, I know that you have a lot to say, and it's a fantastic book, and it's got a lot of content. but I'm going to ask you to be a little bit quicker so we can finish on time when we answer these questions. But anyway, Judith, if you would please.
Yes, I haven't read the book, I'm sorry, but I found it very intriguing. I certainly will have a go at it. But I'm just trying to compare, you compared it with ancient Rome and ancient Greece and places like that. I want to compare it with shop buildings in Southeast Asia, where there is a lot of Chinese living in these kind of areas. And the courtyards from my recollections are very, very different. They are not enclosed. They are not, they have both. They have the social, the collective, as well as the savvy individuals, as a very, very sophisticated type of transition between these places and where you situate yourself as a visitor or as somebody part of the wider collective or the kind of nuclear family. And because so many Chinese are living there and have been living there for so much, so I wondered whether this memory, Confucian memory of vertical, bringing heaven down and so forth, how that applies in these kind of places. The second question is about the Arab house, which is the exact opposite, which is really completely closed. I mean, you don't even have any windows towards the outside. And the streets are non-streets because of that. You just really go from A to B, but they're not the social space. So again, has that to do with the mentality of that type of society or not? And when you look at the loss of the Arab house, as I understand it, in the Gulf states, etc., which are completely gone, and how contemporary Arab societies accommodating to that or not, as a case maybe, I don't know. I would like to know, because I mean, when I was in Abu Dhabi, you could still see, I mean, you had the kind of Western style of tower blocks, etc., but you still had some of that fabric left, which seems to have been lost now. And my experience was I was taken to the desert instead, where they had different way to the heaven. So I'm very intrigued about the kind of cultural differences to this relation between the inner and open world.
Thank you very much, Judith. Alistair, please.
Yeah, thanks, Xing. It's been very interesting. My question is not really an architectural one, but more your take on a sort of the general cultural mood just now in China. So it's kind of within the couplet that I think your book looks at, which is kind of East and West. I mean, in the West just now, I think it's fair to say that there's not much of an appetite for tradition at all, really. I've got a book of my...
Alistair, you've muted yourself.
Oh, sorry.
You say, I have a book, you said. That was it.
Yeah, I've got a book sitting on my desk just now called Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. And it's very, that kind of sense of discovering tradition again is not really something that has a general support just now in the West. I mean, we look at tradition, and there's lots of conversations about things like the era of empire and the colonial times, which is obviously seen as very problematic in the West. Even something like you were talking about the family a few minutes ago. I mean, the take on the family just now in the West is one that it's actually something that's quite problematic. You know, it's something that for many people exists in a private space, and that private space is seen as, in some ways, you know, separate from society, and things go on that are kind of nasty things. There's a kind of suspicion of privacy and the family just now. So I'm wondering, in terms of the general sort of mood in China just now, and this is not just yourself, but more generally, what is the appetite for tradition just now in China? Important, and people are keen to see more of. And if so, how does that then work in terms of the relationship between tradition and the future? Because again, in the West just now, we often see tradition as something of a barrier to creating a better future. So how is it, if tradition is supported in China, that you see it feeding into a better future?
Thanks very much, Alistair. Difficult questions, Xing, if you would, and if we finish in 10 minutes, we can take the next two, and then we'll have a big finish. Thanks, Xing.
Let me try to be brief, but the questions are very big questions and complex questions. So thank you, Judith. And you asked an interesting question about Southeast Asia and the shop houses and the courtyards behind the shops. And in Malaysia, in Malacca, and even in Vietnam, and many places, when the Chinese migrated there and they started building this sort of courtyards. And it is not a unique thing. And I would argue at a certain point of Chinese history, it actually happened, particularly in the 11th century and the Song dynasty. And I made a brief mention in the book. And there's also illustration of the kind of street life where the streets are lined up with shops, and it's full of hustle and bustle. And but I encourage reader to read behind the first layer of the shops, and also the sequential of the courts, and the integrity of the courtyard, and the integrity of the entire city, which I say, you know, most of the Chinese cities are also courtyards. So yes, there is a combination of the street life and the courtyards in Southeast Asia, but whether or not the courts lose their meanings completely, I would argue no, they are not. And it's a different way of striking this balance of what's happening in the society, outside family, and the microcosm of the society, despite the location, whether it's in Southeast Asia or it's in China or at a certain part of the Chinese history. Now, whether or not a completely windowless Arabic courtyard is a sign of an enclosed society, and no, I do not see it in that way, because courtyards are in essence windowless, and if there are any windows, the windows open to the court. So when I describe this animated street life in Beijing, and from Yuan to Ming and Qing dynasties, and I described the kind of street life that comes to life all of a sudden when the street vendors come to sell things, or when there's a noisy wedding or a funeral. And the streets are not lined up with shops, but that does not mean there's no life in the street. And the kind of connection between courts and the hutong and the language are an interesting one. And also the characters living in different courtyards, and then the different social classes form this very unique kind of society. So I'm not going to go into the details, and there's an interesting section in the book about that. Now, Alice's question is an absolutely fascinating one. What is the general mood towards tradition in China and the future? I think the general mood is that tradition needs to be revitalized, and there is a strong desire to know more of its past. And then there's no contradiction. There's no contradiction when it comes to the future projection. Now, I'm fascinated about what you have just said about the lack of appetite for tradition and the family in the West. And I think if we look at the things more carefully, if we scratch the surface a little, when we try to legitimize something that we do, history and the past are often used. And whether or not that's universal, I would say it's pretty universal. So whether or not it's just the surface where tradition is completely disregarded, and I think it's certainly an interesting observation. I pause here.
I see that's maybe the next chapter in the updated book in a couple of years' time. You can ponder that one more widely. Okay, Lawrence, please, if you would.
Thanks, Austin. And thank you, Xing. It's been fascinating listening to you talk about the book. While you were talking, I just purchased a copy, so this is a really effective format. My question, like everyone else, I haven't read the book, so my question is just methodological. I know you primarily as a historian of modern Chinese architectural history. And I'm curious, this book really seems to be testing your scope as the historian, right? You're moving back to the classical period in a way. And I was just curious, one, what sort of challenges this presented to you in terms of archives and archival material, and two, it seemed, an earlier comment that you made about moving away from an emphasis on physical form to me resonated with this, that if we're, if in moving back to the classical, was this also an opportunity to move architectural history beyond an analysis of purely physical forms?
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Lawrence. And finally, Julia, big finish.
Hi, thank you very much, Xing. This has been absolutely fascinating for me. I am a psychiatric nurse and I've got a bit of an interest in the history of old psychiatric hospitals. When you're talking about what you are, it sounds to me like that was the ethos they had years ago when they built hospitals with great big walls around, and everything was focused on the courtyard, which was right in the middle. And we had farms and we had places to train people. We had kitchens to train people to cook, and everything happened around that courtyard. Now, it's not as bad now, the way that there's no wall around these new psychiatric hospitals, but they're still built on the same ethos. You've got wards around, because I used to work in a forensic psychiatric unit. You've got all these walls around, which are everybody's room. And then on the courtyard, everybody gets involved in everything that's going on, and it's absolutely brilliant. But I find the patients that get involved in what's going on in the actual courtyard are the ones that get better quicker and stay better longer. So I just wanted to make that point. Have you ever considered looking at the way that they are built?
Very good, very good. Well-being brought into the conversation late in the day. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, Xing, again, two difficult questions for you. Give it back.
Okay. Lawrence's question, historian, what is the essential skill and the hard work that a historian must do? And I must say this at the outset, I'm not a historian, I'm just an amateur scholar, and I'm an architect by training. But it's an interesting question, and if there's not much left throughout the Chinese history in terms of the physical built world, and what can be used as the evidence. And incidentally, there will be an academic conference tomorrow night, and I've been asked to speak on this very point. And Austin, I can send you the link, and that conference is open to all. And I would say I have adopted a particular approach when it comes to writing history, and in that particular book. That is, of course, I rely on facts and historical evidence, which are readily available, and there's not much archaeological evidence, but there's some, and there are forms, and the description of the forms and city forms that we can get our hands on, and we can understand it. And then there's literature. In the case of Chinese history, there is a massive amount of literature. But in addition to that, and based on the readily available evidence, and which have been tested, and the historical truth, I also use novels, artworks, poetry, and etc. And through them, and I believe they speak to the truth of human life, the individuals. And fiction is not necessarily the bad world in this case. I remember Pierre Ryckmans once said a historian is a novelist of a historian is the novelist of the past, and a novelist is the historian of the present. And we should not be alarmed. This does not indicate, there's no need for historical truths. Of course not. But we should not overlook fiction, because too often reality imitates fiction, because fiction speaks to the truth of human life. And that's the observations of the individuals and the individual lives lived through history. And this is entirely different from social science, which we are so used to. I'm not going to get into details. So I guess that's my answer to Lawrence's question. No, Julia, your observation is absolutely fascinating. Psychiatrical hospital and the Courtyard, whether or not the whole concept of the inner world has the healing capacity, which I think you have provided some assurance. I do hope so. I do hope so. As I return to the earlier question from Austin, if there's any sense of loss, I think if I may conclude that sense of loss is the loss of the inner world, and we both suffer. And because of the loss of the inner world, I think things superficial, pertaining to surface, would overwhelm other senses, to say the least, but more fatally when it overwhelms our mind. And I think we live in a more and increasingly unsettling world. And that's the sense of loss of the inner world. If Courtyard does anything, it provides this metaphor and the reassurance. Yeah.
Shane, thank you very, very much indeed. I had another couple of points to raise, but I would be trampling over your fantastic finish if I did so. So can I ask everyone again to unmute and give a round of applause to Xing, if you would? I'd be very, very grateful to you. First class, Xing, that was terrific.
You didn't ask.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Shane, great speech. I think the book is, for me, highly recommended. As you can probably tell, there's more contained in these 300 pages than you'd imagine. It's a tricky read. It's a very, very rewarding read. And I think it's going to give you some insights, not just into the Chinese mindset, which is what Xing says in the introduction that he wants to do, but actually also into a universal perspective as well, and the changing nature of history. So there's an awful lot there. I would recommend, since it's there now advertised in the chat room, the link to Amazon, get a copy, have a read. Christmas is only 4 weeks away. What a great present you could bring to somebody, bring some joy to somebody's life. But what we would normally do now in a normal Barney is that we would now go down the pub and have a drink and discuss it some more. Unfortunately, we're all over the world and some of us are in lockdown. So I can apologize for that. One day we will meet, shake hands and, well, you know, commune across cultures. So Xing, thanks again. Thank you all for attending. Hope you have a lovely day, evening, night, morning, and we will meet again soon, I'm sure. Thank you all very much indeed. Take care.
Thank you so much, Austin. Thank you all. It's
Thanks,
been a great
Xing.
pleasure.
Take
I wish
care.
I could be there. Great.
One
Bye-bye.
time soon. See you, Xing. Bye-bye.